Hello, I'm Bob the Bookerer and welcome to my channel. And today I wanted to talk about the final book I read from the Booker Prize Longlist, Sarah Perry's Enlightenment. And I will go into some spoilers. I'll try and keep it as spoiler-free as possible, and I will let you know when I'm about to go into spoiler territory. But it's been a fun experience reading, particularly this last little stretch of the Booker Longlist. I think I maybe ran up against some books in a row that weren't necessarily my favourites, but actually this was a really strong end to the book, to the list even, and just also let's just take a moment to appreciate just how gorgeous this cover is. I think I'm always kind of drawn to that kind of sort of spacey, kind of beautiful, kind of radiant colour kind of thing, but this is just a stunning cover. Anyway, let's get started talking about the book. So the core idea behind this book is largely to do with sort of planets and stars, and particularly a comet that is kind of a big part of the book. And so the book really revolves around this set of characters in a relatively small town in Essex in the UK. And I believe from what I've read, I think it's an actual fictional town, but the author herself is sort of very well versed with Essex, so it's sort of modelled on other places. And essentially we start the book with a few characters musing about various things around a comet, trying to understand the comet and where it exists in the world. How it kind of came to be, who saw it first, all of these sorts of things. And this leads them down a bit of a rabbit hole in terms of exploring these old diaries from a Romanian woman who sort of seems to have potentially uncovered some kind of secret behind the comet. And this kind of is a core part of the book. And although there is a big plot point that builds around the comet itself, I kind of liked this as a really interesting framing device, because it basically allows all of the characters to have something they sort of rally around and are focused on, and they focus on that in very, very different ways. So we have Thomas, who I think is just a really interesting character. He's a sort of an older gay man who becomes obsessed in trying to find out more about this. And in many ways, I think he's the character in the book who is the most driven around finding this. He has an article that he writes for a newspaper, a little column for a local newspaper, and that the articles on his little columns appear throughout the book as well. And so the book kind of plays around with kind of textual things as well around that. So, you know, you'll flick through and occasionally you'll have an article, one of his columns, or you'll have an email that a character sends, or you'll have another block of text that's something different. There's something about the kind of sort of the kind of putting together of this book, almost kind of scrapbook feel, that I really enjoyed. It kind of feels even more like you're trying to solve a mini mystery, because you're kind of decoding bits of information from various sources. And so sometimes we see, for example, that Thomas's his column maybe has sort of a kind of public face of what he's saying to people, but privately we know that he's maybe going through slightly more or what have you. And so this sense of his joy and wonder about the natural world is also caught up in this real difficulty and challenge about what it means to be sort of in his circumstance without spoiling anything, and the various things that are happening around him. And so I found him a really fascinating character. And these sort of other characters around, Grace, there's a man called James, and again, I don't want to go into too many details around some of them now, pre-spoilers, because of what it kind of reveals. But there is something about the way that these characters are, the way that something so supernatural is still not enough sometimes for them to kind of get over their kind of ordinary human ness in the ways that, you know, they have disagreements, or these sort of petty squabbles become these much bigger things, all while this incredible, marvelous thing is happening in the sky. And so I think the book does something really interesting in the same way that I think Orbital on the long list did as well, in the ways that it kind of looks at this joy and wonder about the world and takes that to kind of juxtapose with sort of ordinary human pettiness, and all of those sorts of things. And something to say sort of about the writing style on that is, in many ways, the writing style is trying to capture a lot of that wonder and joy. And so it has this really beautiful kind of lyrical quality at times, including some really beautiful passages. And I again, without spoiling anything, there are a couple of bits that I really wanted to sort of highlight from that. There's one point a character taking pain medication, and they describe it as being sort of taking the tablets that make it feel like the pain is happening in another room. And there's something so gorgeous about that framing that I thought was really stunning. And there's another moment where we are told in a couple of sentences a whole world about a character just by the way that they react to a child, for example, where it suddenly becomes the kind of character development is almost done for us just by the way that they think about this child, because we suddenly realize in 2 sentences that this person both doesn't have their own child, some of their feelings towards children, and all of these other things. And I just found it really interesting the ways that this book does this sort of really clever piece of framing to just it's a book that really forces you to slow down, essentially, is what I'm saying. Because often whole bits of movement are happening in just the slightest sort of trickle of words. There's something very subtle about it. And I think that's what I really enjoyed about the writing style of this. Even if that does sometimes mean that this book feels a little bit longer than the almost 400 pages it is. But I think there's something really beautiful about the way the book stops you and sort of slows you down and makes you think a little bit. I really, really appreciated that. So yeah, I really enjoyed this. I've not read anything else by Sarah Perry before, but I really want to now, based on this. I'm going to go a little bit into some of the spoilers, and so feel free to hop off if you need to. Yeah, I hope you enjoy this book if you've read it, and if you have to drop off now, please be my guest and thank you for stopping by. But now let's go on to some spoilers. So a big part of this book, and particularly sort of the plot line of it, and something I found really captivating, was Thomas as a character who basically falls in love with James. And this is very much one-sided. This is Thomas sort of becoming, in some ways, just as obsessed with James as he is about this comet. And the way he often talks about him when he enters a room and all these other things is really sort of indicative of that. And there's something where it always sits on a borderline between being, sometimes feeling quite sweet, that he, you know, has these sort of strong feelings, and sometimes feeling a bit overwhelming and a bit, not necessarily menacing, but there's something slightly uncomfortable about the kind of the strength of that feeling at times. And at one point, the two men are sort of no longer speaking, and Thomas realizes that he can send letters to James and he's not getting responses. And so in some ways, he feels that he can be even more open in these letters, knowing that they might not be read. This then kind of becomes even further, kind of develops even further when he realizes that when he emails James, it's now getting his out of office because he's left that position. And so this is going to a dead number, essentially, a dead email. And so he suddenly feels, well, actually, now I can really pour my heart out. And there's something really heartbreaking about the way this book does this, of this kind of idea of what you would say if you kind of felt that you could pour all of it out, but the person could not see it and could not respond, how you can be kind of even more in depth within that. So that's kind of Thomas as a character. And I've realized I've spent most of this talking about him, but his relationships with the other characters in the book, I think, are really interesting. There's particularly kind of towards the end of the book, a moment where he and Grace, I hope I'm getting these names right, I tend to merge names in my head, and they no longer speak for a while, and there's a real anger and sort of simmering quality to it, and it's really uncomfortable in some ways, because we're mostly sort of seeing this through Thomas's eyes, and so we see the kind of hurt on his side on this, and sort of almost the cluelessness of not fully understanding how that had happened, whilst also sort of knowing. And I think it's so interesting how, you know, there's this moment of wanting to find out more about this this comet often allows Thomas a way back into talking to some of these people. So at one point he's able to invite James to an event that he's been invited along to himself because of everything to do with this comet. And so there are these little ways that he's allowed back into people's lives. And there's something in the book about almost this idea of I think Kepler's law is the one that's mentioned quite a few times. The sort of principles about kind of orbits and people and places not being in the same time frame and zone and all these kind of things. I don't fully understand it, if I'm honest. But there's this idea of these characters rotate around each other. Even the language of the book often uses space and kind of sort of terms relating to space to talk about characters. So characters will be in orbit around each other, characters will move around each other, and there's a very intentional language use all the way through the book that seems to really speak to this being kind of part of these idea of worlds colliding or planets spinning around each other. And there's also, I've jumped around a bit here, but there's also a moment towards the end of part one of this book where a dramatic moment happens, where essentially a house is set on fire, and the mystery of it is later solved, and we come to see how part of the reason it was done was because in somebody's mind, in a sort of moment of basically sort of psychosis, I think, it was believed that this was her sort of communing with a dead person and also kind of fulfilling a destiny. And this idea of fate kind of gets sort of wrapped up in this idea of naming this comet, or this comet's kind of trajectory. There is something coming. The comet is always moving and is going to happen. And there is some stuff that you can predict around it, but there's also something about the spontaneous quality of something like a comet. The book even comments on this at one point, that it is something that forces you to step back and just experience it. You can't summon it, you can't make it happen. You have to just allow it to happen and just watch it while it does. This ephemeral, sort of fleeting moment. And that's something this book really tries to capture, I think, is that idea of life is this weird and wonderful thing, and sometimes things happen and you don't necessarily have a control over those things, but you sort of watch them happen and you have to just react. And that's kind of what happens in many ways to the characters in this book, who, at least in the beginning part, are really trying to lock down and put names and decisions and logic onto something that isn't logical. And I think that's a real strength of this book, is the way that it captures that. I did find the book in some ways a teeny bit, not necessarily long, but it at times sort of felt like it dragged, or I felt like I'd missed something. But I still found this a really captivating read, and there's something kind of magical to this. There's a real quality of sort of beauty and wonder to this book that I found really just engaging. So I hope you've enjoyed this book as much as I did, or more, hopefully. Yeah, I see why it was longlisted. Definitely, it's a really beautiful and slightly haunting book as well. Take care, and speak to you all soon. Bye bye.